if these bones could speak. That's what I whispered to myself as I stood there in the dark. It was a dark, humid corridor. I was looking through a small piece of glass into a small area surrounded by stone and marble. And scratched into the wall by some unknown person in the 4th century were 2 Greek words, Petros eimi. Peter is here. Where was I? I was standing in what is called the Scavi. That is an Italian word for excavations. And I was about 40 feet underground. And what was above me? Oh, nothing much. Just the main altar of St. Peter's Basilica in Vatican City. That's right. Tens of thousands of people were walking on the marble floors of St. Peter's Church, and they were right above me. They were oblivious to the fact that underneath that impressive floor, there is an excavation of ancient roads and grave markers. This excavated area, called the Scavi, is literally underneath the world's largest church. If you're lucky enough to be one of the 250 people who get a ticket to tour the Scavi each day, you feel as if you've entered a different world. And quite frankly, you really have. A little history lesson will help to explain what I'm talking about. On June 29th, the church celebrates the memory of 2 of our most important saints, St. Peter and St. Paul. Because of time constraints, we will focus on St. Peter today. I promise we'll learn more about St. Paul in another presentation. When St. Peter was martyred in Rome in the middle of the 1st century, the early Christians retrieved his body and they buried Peter in a poor grave in an existing cemetery outside the ancient walls of the city of Rome. Some other Christians were buried there, but mostly this cemetery was filled with ancient pagan graves and mausoleums. The cemetery was located on the side of a hill, and that hill was called the Vatican Hill. And St. Peter was buried there. In the 4th century, the Emperor Constantine, who had embraced the Christian faith, decided that he needed to honor St. Peter. So Constantine decided to build a basilica church over the location of Peter's burial spot, taking special care to protect the bones of this great saint. Now, in order to build a big church on the side of a hill, Constantine had to move some dirt. His workers started to dig on one side of the hill, the upper side, to create a flat area. And they took that dirt that they had dug out of the side of the hill, and they moved it and threw it on top of the cemetery that was on the lower part of the hill. You see, you take the dirt from this side, you dig that out, you throw the dirt on this side, and now you have a flat area for the foundation of your new big church. So now let's remember, the workers took that dirt from the side of the hill and they threw it on top of an existing cemetery. They literally buried the cemetery with that dirt. And then they built the church on top of it. Now, historians remembered that there was an ancient cemetery under St. Peter's Church. They also remembered that Peter's bones were buried there. Jump ahead to the 15th century, and that original church built by Constantine was falling apart. And so the Pope at that time decided to tear down the old church, and he decided to build a bigger, much more magnificent church on that same location. And the Pope also ordered that the new church, it's the one we see today, should be built in such a way that the burial spot of St. Peter should be left undisturbed. So they built the foundation of the new church a bit higher, with the floor and walls several meters above the level of the original church. In the middle of the 20th century, workers were digging around a floor in St. Peter's to create a new tomb, and as they were digging, they started to uncover graves and mausoleums from that ancient cemetery that had been covered over with dirt all those centuries before. They kept digging very carefully. Now, remember, again, all of this is happening underneath the main floor of St. Peter's Basilica. So the workers in the 20th century wanted to preserve the ancient graves and all of those structures, but they also had to be sure not to remove too much of the dirt that was around them, because that dirt is literally helping to hold up St. Peter's Church. They excavated carefully for several decades. And today, lucky ticket holders go through a side entrance of the Vatican, and you leave the bright sunlight, and you quickly find yourself walking on a dirt and stone path. On either side of you, there are ancient graves filled with pagan and Christian artwork and inscriptions. Above you is the floor of St. Peter's Church, and around you is a cemetery last seen in the 4th century. And as you approach the end of your tour of the Scavi, the excavations, your guide says to you in a hushed tone, "Directly above us is the main altar of St. Peter's Basilica." And then your guide directs your attention to a box located in a small area made of stone and marble, and you look through the glass that has been placed there to preserve these ancient items. In the 1960s, scientists studied the bones that are in that box. And that box contains bones. Bones including the skull and most of the bones of the body that were carefully studied by experts. And they determined that the bones in that box are the bones of an elderly man of heavy build. His bones had been wrapped with an imperial cloth with gold and purple threads. And the soil adhering to those bones was the soil of that cemetery area. So they concluded that those bones were originally buried right there and have remained there ever since. And near to that box full of those bones of that heavily built man was this inscription in Greek, Petros eini, Peter is here. We will never know with absolute certainty whether these are the bones of St. Peter. I'm not sure science can ever know things like that with absolute certainty. But there they are, exactly where history and tradition told us they would be, exactly where history and tradition told us that Peter was buried. Bones that have been undisturbed since Constantine first built St. Peter's Church in the 4th century. And many, many scientists agree it is very likely that these are the bones of St. Peter. When I first stood in the Scavi and looked in that darkened space, I frankly started to cry. What a powerful experience to be this close to the mortal remains of the man who was chosen by Christ. I've read about St. Peter my whole life. Now I was standing a few feet from his bones. And I whispered to myself, if these bones could speak. There I was, literally a few feet away from the mortal remains of the first pope, literally feet away from Peter, the spokesman of the apostles, Peter, to whom the Lord said, "You are rock, and on this rock I will build my church." Wouldn't it be wonderful if the bones of St. Peter could speak to us today? Wouldn't it be wonderful if Peter could stand in our midst and talk with us today? Well, for the next few minutes, I invite you to imagine with me what St. Peter might say if he could come and speak to us today. Imagine what message St. Peter would bring to us. I think St. Peter would say, "He never gave up on me." Jesus never gave up on me. No matter how I failed him, he never failed me. No matter how I betrayed him, he never betrayed me. No matter how I let him down, he never let me down. He never gave up on me. It all started with a surprise. There I was, minding my own business, supporting my wife and family as a fisherman. And then I met him. Have you ever met someone and right away you know, this person is going to change my life? Do you believe in love at first sight? I do. That's how it was with Jesus. There he was on the shoreline, speaking words that shook me to the core, radiating a joy which was compelling. And then he looked into my eyes and he said, "Follow me." And I did. I had to. I sensed that he had the answers to my deepest questions. So I left my nets and my boat, and I followed him. I wish I could say that I was the perfect follower, but you know my story too well to believe that. You know it's not true. You've heard about that day when he told me to get out of the boat and to walk on the water toward him. I tried, and it worked for a little while, and then I panicked. I took my eyes off of him. When you take your eyes off of Jesus, that's when you start to sink. But he didn't give up on me. He reached out his hand and he kept me from sinking. He didn't give up on me. Even when I put my foot in my mouth at Caesarea Philippi, you remember, he had asked all of us, "Who do people say that I am?" And I blurted out, "You are the Christ of God." I'm still not really sure where that answer came from. But then Jesus started talking about suffering and death, and I told him to stop. And that's when he said to me, the first pope, "Get behind me, Satan." Clearly, I had misunderstood him, but he didn't give up on me. He never gave up on me. At the Last Supper, he washed everybody's feet. How strange that was. The Master serving us. It didn't make any sense. I didn't know what to say or do. But he didn't give up on me. Or in the courtyard outside the house of Caiaphas, the high priest, I denied him 3 times, just as he had predicted. I denied him. He didn't deny me. And then he died on the cross. And where was I when he was suffering? I'm not proud to say it. I was hiding. You have no idea how frightened I was, how lost I felt, how much guilt I had inside of me. But he didn't give up on me. How do I know he didn't give up on me? Well, you hear about it in John's Gospel. I didn't know what else to do after he had died, so I went back to what I knew, back to what was familiar. I went back to Galilee. I went back to fishing. And just like the first time that I saw him, there he was on the shoreline. I knew that he had been buried in a tomb, but here he was, very much alive. When I got close to him, I was sure that he would say something like, "Peter, where were you last Friday when I was suffering? Peter, what were you thinking Thursday night when you denied me?" I was sure he would say to me, "Peter, why did you let me down?" That's what I thought he would say. But instead, he asked me one question 3 times. He asked, "Do you love me?" He didn't give up on me. He kept loving me. And his only question was a simple one. "Do you love me?" And then he said, "If so, then keep doing what you saw me doing. Feed my sheep, tend the flock." Now, I understand that some of you will travel to Rome and stand near my bones in the Scavi. Others will spend your life hearing about me at church or in your Bible study. What I want you to know about Jesus is simple. What I want you to know about Jesus is this: he will never give up on you. On those days when you take your eyes off of him, he does not take his eyes off of you. On those days when you feel like you're sinking, it is his hand that is stretched out to you and pulls you up to safety. On those days when you put your foot in your mouth, he is patient with you. On those days when you deny him or betray him or walk away from him or hide from him, he is there and he's doing the same thing always. He is loving you. And his only question is, do you love me? Listen to my bones. Listen to my message. Listen to my life. For 2,000 years, since they buried my bones on the Vatican Hill, the message has been the same. Fall in love with Jesus. Follow him and trust him. Keep your eyes on him. And on those days, when you happen to fail him, remember, He will never fail you. He never gives up on you. Don't ever give up on yourself, and don't give up on each other. Follow Jesus to the cross. Follow Jesus to the tomb. Follow Jesus to the resurrection. And then, someday, maybe your bones will have something to say too.